Welcome, traveller, to Medieval Screen Finds. Tonight, we journey not to the shadowed castles or the bustling market squares of medieval Europe, but to a slightly later, yet equally fascinating, epoch. We turn our gaze towards the vast, rolling expanse of the open ocean, to an era of daring sails and hidden coves, an age often painted with broad strokes of adventure and defiance, the Golden Age of Piracy. This period, roughly spanning from the late 17th to the early 18th century, was a transient window in history where the lines between law and lawlessness blurred upon the high seas, giving rise to figures who would etch their names, for better or worse, into the annals of legend. Among these figures, one name resonates with particular force, a silhouette against the setting sun of maritime history that remains instantly recognizable. We speak, of course, of Captain Edward Teach, though he is far better known by the terrifying moniker he so carefully cultivated, Blackbeard. His very name evokes images of smoke, fire, and an untamed spirit, a figure who has transcended historical fact to become an icon, a symbol of the freebooting life. Tonight, as the modern world outside continues its restless turning, we invite you to settle in, to let your thoughts soften, and to allow the gentle rhythm of our narrative to guide you. We will embark on a quiet exploration, not of a frantic chase, but of a life lived on the fringes of society, a life that, for a time, commanded the respect and terror of vast stretches of the Atlantic. Our purpose is to delve into the intricate weave of his existence, to understand the man behind the fearsome legend, and to observe the world he inhabited in all its brutal reality and fleeting opportunity. Allow your mind to drift as we begin to uncover the story of Blackbeard. If stories like this help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting about seeing all the places where these quiet stories reach. Our story begins not with the roar of cannon fire, but with a quiet speculation. Edward Teach, the man who would become Blackbeard, is believed to have been born in the city of Bristol, England, around the year 1680. Imagine, if you will, the Bristol of that time, a bustling port city, its docks perpetually alive with the cries of merchants, the creak of timber, and the constant coming and going of ships bound for every corner of the known world. The air would have been thick with the scent of salt, tar, and exotic spices carried on the maritime breeze. It was a place where the young, the ambitious, and the restless might easily look to the horizon and dream of distant shores. Yet, despite Bristol's prominence and Teach's later notoriety, the details of his early life remain largely shrouded in the mists of time. We have no definitive records of his childhood, his family, or his first steps onto a ship's deck. This absence of early documentation is not uncommon for individuals of that era, particularly those who would later embrace a life outside the conventional societal norms. It forces us to rely on the broader strokes of history to piece together the likely path that led him from the quiet anonymity of a Bristol upbringing to the decks of a pirate vessel. It is widely assumed, and with good reason, that Edward Teach began his maritime career not as a pirate, but as a privateer. This distinction is crucial to understanding the context of his later actions. The turn of the 18th century was a time of almost perpetual conflict among the great European powers. From 1701 to 1714, the War of the Spanish Succession, often known in the Americas as Queen Anne's War, raged across continents and oceans. During such conflicts, governments would issue letters of marque to private ship owners, authorizing them to attack and capture enemy merchant vessels. These privateers, though operating for profit, were technically legitimate naval adjuncts, their actions sanctioned by the Crown. Imagine yourself aboard such a vessel during these turbulent years. The discipline would have been harsh, the living conditions cramped and unsanitary. Yet the work itself would have honed invaluable skills: seamanship, navigation, gunnery, boarding tactics, and the brutal realities of close-quarters combat. A privateer's life was one of constant vigilance, sudden violence, and the tantalizing promise of prize money. For a young man like Teach, it would have been a crucible, forging him into a hardened mariner, intimately familiar with the rhythms of the sea and the art of maritime warfare. He would have learned how to command, how to inspire fear, and how to assess a ship's weaknesses. As the War of the Spanish Succession drew to a close with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, a significant shift occurred in the maritime world, one that profoundly shaped the landscape for men like Teach. Thousands of privateers, their commissions now revoked, suddenly found themselves unemployed. The legitimate avenues for their unique, often brutal skill sets had evaporated. They were men trained for war, accustomed to the prospect of wealth through capture, now facing the bleak realities of meager pay on merchant ships, harsh naval discipline, or outright destitution. This vast pool of skilled, restless, and often desperate mariners converged with another powerful force: the booming transatlantic trade. Ships laden with valuable goods, sugar, tobacco, rum, textiles, and precious metals, flowed steadily between the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe. These merchant vessels, often lightly armed and undercrewed, presented tempting targets. Furthermore, the established navies of the European powers were stretched thin, their resources often focused on policing European waters rather than the sprawling, distant trade routes of the New World. This created vast areas of opportunity, fertile ground for those willing to step outside the bounds of law. Thus, the Golden Age of Piracy, in large part, emerged from this nexus. The sudden unemployment of hardened privateers, the burgeoning wealth of global trade, and the temporary vacuum of effective naval control. Men like Edward Teach, possessing the skills, the experience, and perhaps a growing disregard for conventional authority, found themselves poised at a crossroads. The path of legitimate but low-paying employment lay open, or, more enticingly, the path of the pirate, promising swift, albeit dangerous, riches. It was into this tumultuous, opportunistic environment that Edward Teach, the former privateer, began his transformation into the legendary Blackbeard. Yet, despite Bristol's prominence and Teach's later notoriety, the details of his early life remain largely shrouded in the mists of time. We have no definitive records of his childhood, his family, or his first steps onto a ship's deck. This absence of early documentation is not uncommon for individuals of that era, particularly those who would later embrace a life outside the conventional societal norms. It forces us to rely on the broader strokes of history to piece together the likely path that led him from the quiet anonymity of a Bristol upbringing to the decks of a pirate vessel. It is widely assumed, and with good reason, that Edward Teach began his maritime career not as a pirate, but as a privateer. This distinction is crucial to understanding the context of his later actions. The turn of the 18th century was a time of almost perpetual conflict among the great European powers. From 1701 to 1714, the War of the Spanish Succession, often known in the Americas as Queen Anne's War, raged across continents and oceans. During such conflicts, governments would issue letters of marque to private ship owners, authorizing them to attack and capture enemy merchant vessels. These privateers, though operating for profit, were technically legitimate naval adjuncts, their actions sanctioned by the Crown. Imagine yourself aboard such a vessel during these turbulent years. The discipline would have been harsh, the living conditions cramped and unsanitary. Yet, the work itself would have honed invaluable skills: seamanship, navigation, gunnery, boarding tactics, and the brutal realities of close-quarters combat. A privateer's life was one of constant vigilance, sudden violence, and the tantalizing promise of prize money. For a young man like Teach, it would have been a crucible, forging him into a hardened mariner, intimately familiar with the rhythms of the sea and the art of maritime warfare. He would have learned how to command, how to inspire fear, and how to assess a ship's weaknesses. As the War of the Spanish Succession drew to a close with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, a significant shift occurred in the maritime world, one that profoundly shaped the landscape for men like Teach. Thousands of privateers, their commissions now revoked, suddenly found themselves unemployed. The legitimate avenues for their unique, often brutal skill sets had evaporated. They were men trained for war, accustomed to the prospect of wealth through capture, now facing the bleak realities of meager pay on merchant ships, harsh naval discipline, or outright destitution. This vast pool of skilled, restless, and often desperate mariners converged with another powerful force: the booming transatlantic trade. Ships laden with valuable goods, sugar, tobacco, rum, textiles, and precious metals, flowed steadily between the Americas, the Caribbean, and Europe. These merchant vessels, often lightly armed and undercrewed, presented tempting targets. Furthermore, the established navies of the European powers were stretched thin. Their resources often focused on policing European waters, rather than the sprawling, distant trade routes of the New World. This created vast areas of opportunity, fertile ground for those willing to step outside the bounds of law. Thus, the Golden Age of Piracy, in large part, emerged from this nexus: the sudden unemployment of hardened privateers, the burgeoning wealth of global trade, and the temporary vacuum of effective naval control. Men like Edward Teach, possessing the skills, the experience, and perhaps a growing disregard for conventional authority, found themselves poised at a crossroads. The path of legitimate but low-paying employment lay open, or, more enticingly, the path of the pirate, promising swift, albeit dangerous, riches. It was into this tumultuous, opportunistic environment that Edward Teach, the former privateer, began his transformation into the legendary Blackbeard. With the magnificent Queen Anne's Revenge under his command, Edward Thatch transformed not just his ship, but himself. This was the period where the persona of Blackbeard truly coalesced, becoming less a man and more a terrifying force of nature. His success was built not merely on firepower, but on an astute understanding of human psychology. He recognized that fear, strategically applied, could be a far more potent weapon than cannon fire or cold steel. Why risk a bloody fight, endure casualties, or expend precious shot and powder when the mere sight of him, or the chilling whisper of his name, could compel a ship to surrender without a struggle? This was his genius, the careful cultivation of a terrifying brand, a calculated campaign of psychological warfare that preceded his every move. Imagine, for a moment, the ordinary merchant sailor of the early 18th century. Their lives were already fraught with peril, storms that could splinter a ship like matchwood, diseases that swept through crews with merciless efficiency, the constant threat of starvation or thirst, and the ever-present danger of shipwreck on unseen reefs. To these existing fears, Blackbeard added a new, almost supernatural dread. He deliberately crafted an appearance designed to evoke primal terror. Contemporary accounts, particularly from Captain Charles Johnson's influential 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, paint a vivid, if perhaps slightly embellished picture. Johnson describes him in stark terms. So our hero, Captain Teach, assumed the cognomen of Blackbeard from that large quantity of hair, which, like a frightful meteor, covered his whole face, and frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there a long time. This wasn't merely a beard. It was a vast, untamed mass, intricately braided with ribbons, often black, matching the deep, fathomless colour of his reputation. It was a dark, swirling cloud of hair that seemed to absorb all light, framed by eyes that, even in historical retellings, pierce through the centuries. But Blackbeard's theatrics went far beyond his facial hair. He would often go into battle adorned with multiple pistols, sometimes as many as 3 braced in holsters across his chest, and several more tucked into his belt. Imagine the clink and weight of these instruments of death, a constant reminder of their imminent use. Knives and cutlasses would hang from his waist, providing a lethal silhouette. His clothing, while not explicitly detailed, would likely have been dark, perhaps rugged and imposing, contributing to the overall grim tableau. The most iconic and perhaps most terrifying aspect of his appearance involved fire. Before engaging an enemy, or even simply making a dramatic entrance, Blackbeard would reportedly weave slow-burning fuses into his long beard, sometimes even under the brim of his hat. These fuses, once lit, would smoulder and spark, emitting thin wisps of smoke that curled around his head, creating an infernal halo. Imagine this sight on a dark, moonless night, perhaps with the flickering light of a distant lantern on a merchant ship. A hulking figure emerging from the shadows, wreathed in smoke, his eyes glinting in the faint, flickering glow of the burning fuses. The smell of sulphur and smouldering cordage would drift on the sea breeze, a noxious herald of his approach. It was a vision designed to unnerve, to suggest a demonic presence rather than a mortal man. This was not random eccentricity, it was calculated psychological warfare. The fear he inspired was palpable, deeply unsettling. It capitalized on the superstitions common among sailors of the era, blurring the lines between man and monster. He wasn't just a pirate. He was the frightful meteor, a supernatural omen, a harbinger of doom. And this fear proved immensely effective. Many ships, upon sighting the Queen Anne's Revenge and catching even a glimpse of her smoke-shrouded captain, would immediately surrender. This was the ultimate victory for Blackbeard. Plunder acquired without a single shot fired, without a single casualty sustained by his own crew. It preserved his manpower, conserved his ammunition, and reinforced the very legend that made such bloodless victories possible. His reputation, carefully nurtured, extended beyond his appearance. Rumors, often exaggerated but always compelling, would precede him. Tales of his ruthlessness, his daring, his seemingly invincible nature would spread through port towns like wildfire. Sailors would whisper stories of his feats, of ships that simply gave up at the mere mention of his name. This self-perpetuating cycle of fear was a critical component of his success. The psychological terror he inflicted saved him countless resources and solidified his dominance. Consider the practical implications of this strategy. A pirate crew's greatest assets were its men and its powder. Every engagement risked losing both. By terrifying his victims into submission, Blackbeard ensured his crew remained largely intact, ready for the next undertaking. This meant more men to man the Queen Anne's Revenge, more men to board future prizes, and a sustained level of operational readiness that few other pirate captains could maintain. His approach was not brute force for its own sake, but controlled, theatrical violence designed for maximum psychological impact and minimum actual cost. Blackbeard's domain, once he had the formidable Queen Anne's Revenge under his command, stretched far and wide. He rampaged up and down the American East Coast, from the bustling harbors of the Carolinas to the established trade lanes leading to Havana. His movements were not random. They were strategic, targeting the busiest shipping lanes, the arteries of colonial commerce. The takings were varied, reflecting the diverse goods transported across the Atlantic. Spice-laden vessels from the West Indies, ships carrying timber and furs from the northern colonies, flour and provisions destined for growing settlements, rum, sugar, all became potential prizes. Imagine the routine of these captures. Once a merchant ship surrendered, Blackbeard's crew would board, their imposing presence often enough to quell any lingering resistance. The valuable cargo would be systematically inspected. Goods deemed useful or highly profitable, often basic commodities like food, cloth, tools, or building materials, would be transferred to the Queen Anne's Revenge or other ships in Blackbeard's expanding flotilla. The more valuable and easily portable items, such as silver, gold, and jewels, would naturally be secured. A critical aspect of the pirate economy and Blackbeard's operations was the resale of these captured goods. Pirates couldn't simply sail into any port and openly sell their plunder without attracting unwanted attention. Instead, they often relied on illicit trade with corrupt merchants or colonial officials in more remote or less policed settlements. These fences would buy the stolen goods at a reduced price, then resell them through legitimate channels, often making a handsome profit. This underground network was vital for turning perishable goods into hard currency or other supplies the pirates needed. It speaks to the complex, often shadowy, relationships that existed between the pirate world and the seemingly respectable society it preyed upon. Blackbeard understood the importance of this network. He knew that maintaining a constant flow of useful goods was as important as acquiring treasure. His crew needed provisions, his ships needed repairs, and his legend needed to be fueled by consistent success. The systematic nature of his raids, the organized transfer of goods, and the established channels for their disposal all point to a shrewd mind at work, far beyond the image of a simple, chaotic brigand. He was, in essence, running a highly effective, albeit illegal, enterprise, powered by intimidation and strategic plunder. His control over his crew was also a testament to his leadership. While pirate ships were often run on a more democratic basis than naval vessels, with articles outlining rights and duties, the captain still wielded immense authority, particularly in battle and when making strategic decisions. Blackbeard's ability to maintain discipline among a diverse and often volatile group of men speaks volumes about his charisma and his formidable presence. His crew, though perhaps terrified of him, also respected his success and his ability to deliver them consistent profits. They understood that his terrifying persona was not just for show, it was a tool that directly benefited them all. The very air around Blackbeard must have hummed with a dark energy, a constant tension that kept both his enemies and perhaps even some of his own men on edge. He was a master of grand gestures, of creating an aura of unpredictability that further solidified his legend. This deliberate cultivation of dread, interwoven with his strategic mastery of the seas and his keen eye for profit, propelled him to the undisputed pinnacle of Golden Age piracy. The sound of the wind filling the sails of the Queen Anne's Revenge, now a vessel of pure, unadulterated terror, echoed the growing fear that he instilled across the Atlantic world. By the spring of 1718, Captain Edward Teach, the fearsome Blackbeard, was at the absolute zenith of his power and notoriety. He commanded not just the formidable Queen Anne's Revenge, but a small flotilla of captured vessels, creating a menacing squadron that ruled vast stretches of the Atlantic seaboard. His crew had swelled, drawn by his consistent success and the allure of rich plunder. The whispers of his name, once confined to pirate havens, now echoed with dread in the respectable halls of colonial governance and along every busy merchant dock. It was in May of 1718 that Blackbeard executed perhaps his most audacious act of intimidation, one that brought the very heart of colonial commerce to a standstill. He set his sights on Charlestown, Now Charleston, the thriving capital of the province of South Carolina. Imagine Charlestown at this time, a prosperous port, its harbour often crowded with ships laden with indigo, rice, deerskins, and other valuable commodities destined for England. It was a vital economic hub, a lifeline for the entire colony, and a symbol of British authority in the southern colonies. Blackbeard, with his squadron of 4 ships, including the imposing Queen Anne's Revenge, did not simply raid a vessel or two. He blockaded the entire port. Picture the scene: the narrow entrance to Charlestown Harbour, a critical artery, suddenly choked by pirate vessels. No ship could enter, and no ship could leave, without facing the overwhelming firepower of Teach's fleet. This was not a hit-and-run attack. It was a deliberate, calculated siege designed to extract maximum leverage. For nearly a week, the port remained paralysed. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. Goods perishable and non-perishable lay rotting in holds or piled on wharves. Merchants faced ruin, their investments trapped, their trade routes severed. The entire colony held its breath, witnessing an unprecedented act of defiance against colonial authority. This audacious move wasn't about seizing specific cargo from a single ship. It was about asserting dominance, demonstrating the pirates' power to disrupt the very foundations of colonial life. During this blockade, Blackbeard made his demands clear. His primary request was not for gold or jewels, but for a rather specific and unexpected form of ransom: a chest of medicines. This might seem peculiar for a ruthless pirate, but it speaks to the harsh realities of life at sea. Disease, particularly venereal disease, was rampant among pirate crews, and medical supplies were scarce and vital. It's believed that some of Teach's crew were suffering from an outbreak, and he recognized the pragmatic necessity of these supplies for his men's well-being and the continued operational effectiveness of his fleet. To ensure his demands were met, Teach seized several prominent citizens and officials from a ship attempting to enter the harbour, holding them as hostages. These individuals were men of standing and influence within the community, their capture sending shivers of apprehension through the town. This tactic dramatically increased the pressure on the Charlestown authorities. The colonial government, along with the wealthy gentlemen and merchant class of Charlestown, found themselves in an untenable position. They were utterly humiliated and economically strangled. They had no immediate naval force capable of confronting Blackbeard's powerful squadron. To resist would mean devastating economic losses and potentially the brutal end of their prominent citizens. Faced with this stark reality, they reluctantly agreed to Blackbeard's terms. Imagine the tension as the chest of medicines was finally delivered. It was a tacit acknowledgement of Blackbeard's power, a humbling capitulation by a major British colony to a pirate captain. With his demands met and his hostages released unharmed, Teach, satisfied with his ransom, and having made an unforgettable statement, lifted the blockade. His ships, their ominous flags still snapping in the breeze, simply sailed away, leaving Charlestown to slowly exhale, its harbour once again open, but its pride undoubtedly wounded. This bold manoeuvre, however, came at a peculiar time for Blackbeard. The British Crown, increasingly exasperated by the rampant piracy that threatened its valuable trade routes, had recently offered an olive branch, the King's Pardon of 1717 to 1718. This pardon, issued by King George I, promised a full amnesty to any pirate who surrendered to a governor or colonial authority by a certain date and swore an oath to abandon their piratical ways. It was a pragmatic attempt to thin the ranks of the pirates, to entice them back to a life of legality, rather than pursuing the costly and often futile military option of hunting them all down. Many pirates, seeing the writing on the wall as naval patrols increased, genuinely accepted the pardon, Even Benjamin Hornigold, Teach's former mentor, had taken the pardon and subsequently became a pirate hunter himself, turning against his former compatriots. It was a complex moral landscape where loyalty was fluid and survival paramount. Remarkably, after his display of power at Charlestown, Blackbeard himself accepted the king's pardon. He sailed to Bathtown, now Bath, a small settlement in North Carolina, and surrendered to Governor Charles Eden. Imagine the quiet, almost anticlimactic scene. The fearsome Blackbeard, the scourge of the seas, standing before a colonial governor, seemingly laying down his arms. He received his certificate of pardon, ostensibly transforming him from a notorious outlaw into a legitimate subject of the crown. However, the motivations behind Teach's acceptance of the pardon are a subject of much historical debate and speculation. Was it a genuine desire to retire from the arduous and dangerous life of piracy? Perhaps a yearning for a quieter existence, to enjoy his amassed wealth without constant fear of pursuit? It is possible, but given his subsequent actions, it seems more likely that his acceptance was a highly strategic move, a calculated act of accommodation. One prevailing theory suggests that Teach used the pardon as a means to legitimize his presence in North Carolina and protect his ill-gotten gains. By officially retiring, he could ostensibly enjoy his wealth without immediate threat of capture, while still maintaining connections that could facilitate his true intentions. He was, in essence, trying to play both sides, to exploit the loopholes in the system for his own benefit. And indeed, it soon became clear that Blackbeard had little intention of truly changing his piratical ways. Almost immediately after receiving his pardon, he began to work in a shadowy tandem with none other than Governor Charles Eden himself, the very man who had granted him amnesty. This relationship was a classic example of colonial corruption. Evidence suggests that Governor Eden, along with his secretary Tobias Knight, was receiving a cut of Teach's illicit takings in exchange for turning a blind eye to his continued piratical activities, or perhaps even providing him with information or protection. Imagine the quiet whispers in the colonial taverns, the knowing glances between those who suspected the truth. Blackbeard, ostensibly pardoned, now lived in Bath, a seemingly respectable citizen, yet ships continued to disappear, and valuable goods continued to flow into the colony through unofficial channels. He was essentially operating as a state-sanctioned pirate, exploiting the vast, sparsely governed coastal regions of North Carolina as his personal hunting grounds, all while enjoying the protection of its highest official. This arrangement allowed Blackbeard to continue seizing vessels, though perhaps on a smaller, more discreet scale than his grand blockade. He would target ships, especially those bringing goods into North Carolina, claiming them as salvage from shipwrecks, or alleging they were legitimate prizes under some fabricated legal pretense. The goods would then be brought ashore, ostensibly sold legally, with a portion finding its way into the pockets of Eden and Knight. It was a lucrative, if utterly corrupt, partnership that enabled Teach to continue his life of plunder under a veneer of legality. However, such an arrangement, no matter how carefully orchestrated, could not remain entirely hidden. The continued disappearances of ships, the suspicious wealth of certain officials, and the sheer audacity of Blackbeard's apparent freedom began to stir deep resentment and outrage among the law-abiding merchants and citizens of neighboring colonies, particularly in Virginia. They saw the blatant disregard for the king's law, the corrupt practices that undermined legitimate trade, and the chilling presence of the infamous pirate still operating with impunity. The tension mounted. The comfortable equilibrium that Blackbeard and Governor Eden had established was inherently unstable, built upon a foundation of illicit gain and public outrage. It was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. And that spark would soon come from a determined figure in a neighboring colony, someone who saw the corruption in North Carolina not just as a local problem, but as a direct threat to the stability and integrity of the Crown's authority in the entire region. The calm, deceptive waters of Teach's pardoned existence were about to be violently disturbed. Following his audacious blockade of Charlestown and his subsequent acceptance of the king's pardon in Bathtown, Captain Edward Teach entered a new, peculiar phase of his piratical career. Outwardly, he was a reformed man, a recipient of royal grace, permitted to reside peacefully within the nascent colonial settlements of North Carolina. He even took a local bride, further cementing his apparent transition into legitimate society. Yet beneath this thin veneer of respectability, the deep currents of his true nature continued to flow, undisturbed by any genuine change of heart. Indeed, Teach's retirement was less an abandonment of piracy and more a sophisticated repackaging of his illicit activities, carefully orchestrated through a corrupt alliance with North Carolina's Governor Charles Eden and his secretary, Tobias Knight. Imagine the hushed conversations in dimly lit rooms, the subtle exchange of information, the quiet flow of goods that bypassed official customs. This arrangement was remarkably convenient for Teach. It provided him with a measure of protection, a safe harbor, and a seemingly legitimate outlet for his ill-gotten gains. For Eden and Knight, it offered a clandestine source of wealth, a dark revenue stream that swelled their personal coffers, far from the watchful eyes of distant London. Teach's operations during this period were often subtle, insidious, and carefully masked. He no longer engaged in overt blockades or full-scale attacks on the high seas that would draw immediate, undeniable attention. Instead, his methods shifted. He would seize vessels under the pretense of salvage, claiming to have discovered them abandoned or shipwrecked, their cargoes ripe for the taking. He might assert a dubious legal claim over a vessel found slightly off course, or perhaps even orchestrate a false wreck to justify plundering its contents. These salvage operations often involved goods from ships that had mysteriously run aground or simply vanished, with Teach's well-armed crew conveniently appearing to recover the cargo. The goods, once salvaged, would then be quietly offloaded in remote inlets or brought directly into Bath, where Governor Eden's officials would officially condemn them, allowing Teach to legally sell the plunder, taking his cut, and passing a portion to his corrupt protectors. This intricate dance between ostensible legitimacy and blatant criminality was deeply unsettling to the more upright citizens and merchants of neighboring colonies. They observed with growing alarm the continued flow of suspicious wealth into North Carolina and the unmolested presence of the notorious pirate. The waters around North Carolina, particularly the intricate and treacherous labyrinth of the Outer Banks and their inlets, became Teach's de facto domain, a sanctuary where he could operate with a dangerous impunity. It was amidst this complex web of corruption and clandestine operations that one of the most pivotal and debated events of Blackbeard's career occurred: the grounding of his magnificent flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. This happened in early June of 1718, just weeks after the Charlestown blockade and his acceptance of the pardon. Teach's flotilla, which at this point included the Queen Anne's Revenge and his consort sloop, the Adventure, along with two other smaller vessels, was navigating the notoriously treacherous waters near Topsail Inlet, now Beaufort Inlet, on the North Carolina coast. Imagine the challenging seascape of the Outer Banks, a dynamic, ever-shifting barrier of sandbars, shoals, and shallow channels that stretched for miles, constantly reshaped by the powerful currents and relentless storms of the Atlantic. These waters, though providing excellent hiding places for pirates, were notoriously unforgiving to large, deep-draft vessels. To navigate them successfully required intimate local knowledge, careful piloting, and a healthy respect for the unpredictable nature of the underwater landscape. As Teach's squadron attempted to enter Topsail Inlet, disaster struck. The Queen Anne's Revenge, with its deep keel, ran hard aground on a sandbar. Moments later, The Adventure, attempting to assist or follow, also became stranded. Imagine the sudden, jarring shock of the impact, the sickening shudder that would reverberate through the massive wooden hull, the frantic shouts as the crew realized their predicament. The rhythmic hum of the ship would have ceased, replaced by the grating sound of wood against sand, the rising panic of men trapped. The grounding of his flagship presented Teach with a profound dilemma. Was this merely a tragic navigational error in notoriously difficult waters, a cruel twist of fate? Or was it, as many historians and contemporary observers have long suspected, a deliberate act, a calculated maneuver to achieve a specific, ruthless objective? This question lies at the heart of the enigma surrounding Blackbeard's final months. Let us explore the arguments for intentional grounding. Teach was, by all accounts, a shrewd and calculating individual, not prone to casual oversight, especially concerning his primary instrument of power. Firstly, he had just accepted the king's pardon. While he continued to operate illicitly, maintaining such a large and conspicuous fleet as the Queen Anne's Revenge and its consorts might have been seen as a liability, too blatant a defiance of his supposed retirement. A smaller, less noticeable vessel would be far easier to operate under the radar of corrupt protection, less likely to draw the ire of vigilant colonial governors like Alexander Spotswood of Virginia, who we will discuss shortly. Running aground the Queen Anne's Revenge would effectively decommission his most recognizable symbol, allowing him to scale down his operation without publicly abandoning piracy. Secondly, and perhaps more chillingly, was the issue of treasure and crew shares. A pirate crew, by their very nature, was a collection of individuals expecting a share of the spoils. The larger the crew, the smaller each individual share. Teach had amassed considerable wealth, both from past raids and from the Charlestown ransom. A common tactic among pirate captains wishing to hoard more treasure for themselves was to find a pretext to disperse or abandon a significant portion of their crew. The grounding of a large vessel like the Queen Anne's Revenge would provide the perfect, seemingly unavoidable excuse to do just that. With the ship trapped, many men would be needed to attempt salvage, while others could be sent ashore or simply left behind. This would allow Teach to select a small, highly trusted inner circle, consolidate the most valuable plunder, and slip away with a far larger share per man. It was a brutal but effective way to consolidate power and wealth. Finally, the very nature of the waters around Topsail Inlet lends credence to the intentional theory. While treacherous, Teach had navigated them previously and was known to employ pilots with intimate knowledge of the local channels. For such a large, valuable vessel to run aground in waters he purportedly knew, especially alongside another of his ships, raises suspicions. It suggests that perhaps the grounding was not due to an accidental lack of knowledge, but a deliberate miscalculation or even a direct order, designed to ensure the ships were stranded. On the other hand, the argument for accidental grounding cannot be entirely dismissed. The Outer Banks were, and remain, notoriously dangerous. Even today, with modern navigation technology, vessels run aground there. In the early 18th century, charts were rudimentary, currents unpredictable, and sandbars constantly shifting. A moment's inattention, a sudden squall, or an unexpected shift in the channel could easily doom even the most experienced pilot. Teach, despite his skill, was still human, and even the most formidable pirate could fall victim to the whims of the sea. His hubris, cultivated by years of success, might also have led him to take unnecessary risks in navigating such challenging waters. Archaeological evidence from the wreck site of the Queen Anne's Revenge, discovered in 1996 and extensively studied since, offers tantalizing clues, but no definitive answer to this debate. The layout of the wreckage, the distribution of artifacts, and the evidence of rapid sinking might suggest a sudden, catastrophic event consistent with accidental grounding. However, the precise circumstances of the grounding itself, how the ship struck, the speed, the angle, are complex to definitively determine from a centuries-old shipwreck. The archaeological findings confirm the ship's identity and its pirate conversion, but the motivation behind its final resting place remains a subject of ongoing interpretation. Regardless of whether it was intentional or accidental, the immediate consequence of the grounding was undeniably severe for a large portion of Teach's crew. With the Queen Anne's Revenge and the Adventure stuck fast, Teach moved swiftly and ruthlessly. He transferred all the valuable treasure, along with provisions and supplies, from the grounded ships onto one of his smaller sloops. Then, with a cold efficiency, he abandoned a large segment of his crew. Estimates range from 80 to 120 men on the deserted sandbars of the Outer Banks. These men were left stranded, disarmed, and cheated out of their share of the recent plunder, a stark and brutal illustration of Teach's pragmatic cruelty. Their cries, unheard across the vast, indifferent ocean, would have marked the shattering of the fragile pirate code that promised shares and camaraderie. With his loyal, chosen few, a mere 40 men or so, and the consolidated treasure, Teach made his way to Ocracoke Island. This isolated sliver of land, further down the Outer Banks, offered a secluded and defensible haven. Here, amidst the quiet marshes and maritime forests, he believed himself safe, enjoying the ill-gotten gains with his trusted inner circle, all under the tacit protection of Governor Eden. He had effectively streamlined his operation, minimized his crew, and supposedly eliminated the biggest target, the Queen Anne's Revenge, from drawing immediate attention. It seemed, for a brief moment, that he had masterfully navigated the treacherous waters of both the sea and colonial politics. Yet, this was the grave mistake, the calculated gamble that would ultimately lead to his undoing. The abandoned men, some of whom managed to make their way to legitimate settlements, carried with them stories of Blackbeard's betrayal. Their accounts, coupled with the continued, undeniable evidence of Teach's illicit activities, would finally ignite the fury of those who simply could not tolerate his continued reign of terror and corruption. The quiet retreat to Ocracoke was less a sanctuary and more a trap, slowly, inexorably tightening around the notorious pirate, the calm before a storm, the silence before the final, desperate clash. The deliberate abandonment of a large portion of his crew on the Outer Banks, coupled with the increasingly brazen, if subtle nature of Edward Teach's continued piratical activities under the corrupt aegis of Governor Charles Eden, finally pushed colonial patience to its breaking point. While Governor Eden and his secretary Tobias Knight reveled in their illicit gains and turned a blind eye, the repercussions of Teach's presence resonated far beyond North Carolina's borders. The whispers of his continued freedom, the inexplicable loss of merchant vessels, and the very affront to law and order deeply agitated the more scrupulous elements of colonial society, especially in the neighboring and more established province of Virginia. Imagine the mounting frustration boiling in the prosperous ports and burgeoning plantations of Virginia. Merchants who saw their meticulously planned trade routes jeopardized and their hard-earned profits systematically siphoned off by Teach's veiled predation, expressed their indignation in no uncertain terms. Their ships, carrying vital goods to and from England, faced an uncertain fate in waters that should have been safe under the King's peace. Planters, reliant on the timely and secure passage of their valuable tobacco and other crops to market, watched with growing alarm as the news of suspicious disappearances or salvaged cargoes spread. The respectable citizens, proud of their adherence to Crown law and their ordered society, felt a profound sense of injustice, almost a personal insult, at the blatant corruption openly flaunted just across their southern border. For them, Teach was not merely a local nuisance to North Carolina. He was a symptom of a systemic breakdown, a dangerous precedent that threatened the very fabric of colonial governance and legitimate commerce throughout the region. The king's pardon, so grandly offered, seemed instead to have granted immunity to its most infamous practitioner, creating a perception of weakness and insidious complicity within the very system it was designed to uphold. It was into this atmosphere, thick with complaint and quiet outrage, that a formidable figure stepped forward: Alexander Spotswood, the ambitious and highly effective governor of Virginia. Spotswood was no mere passive administrator. He was a dynamic, proactive leader, possessing a keen political mind and a deep-seated commitment to asserting the authority of the British Crown. But beyond his official duties, he harbored a profound interest in expanding his own influence and, perhaps more significantly, in enhancing the prestige and economic dominance of his colony. He had already proven himself a strong governor, initiating ambitious projects like the westward expansion of settlement and securing Virginia's frontiers against various threats. The continued, unmolested presence of Teach in neighboring North Carolina, operating with such blatant impunity, was an intolerable affront to Spotswood's vision of orderly colonial rule and his personal gubernatorial prerogatives. For Spotswood, the pursuit of Blackbeard was a mission laden with multiple layers of motivation. On one level, it was undeniably a genuine campaign to uphold justice, to rid the valuable colonial trade lanes of a destructive and corrupting element. The pivotal factor that truly galvanized his resolve was the influx of accounts from Teach's abandoned crew members. These men, cast adrift after the grounding of the Queen Anne's Revenge, eventually made their way to legitimate settlements, including those in Virginia. Their desperate stories, recounting Teach's calculated treachery and his continued piratical behavior despite the pardon, provided irrefutable evidence. This was no longer just rumor or suspicion. It was direct testimony, unequivocally undermining Teach's pardon and fueling the righteous indignation that Spotswood could now wield with undeniable force. On another, perhaps equally powerful level, the hunt for Blackbeard represented a profound political opportunity for Spotswood. North Carolina, largely underdeveloped, sparsely populated, and governed with a notoriously loose hand, was often viewed by its more established neighbors like Virginia as a somewhat unruly and provincial backwater. By intervening decisively and successfully eliminating this symbol of unchecked lawlessness, Spotswood could not only remove a major threat to trade, but also assert Virginia's dominance in regional affairs. This intervention would publicly expose and implicitly condemn Governor Eden's corruption, potentially embarrassing him to the higher authorities in London, and casting Spotswood himself as the true champion of Crown interests in the colonies. It was a calculated risk, undertaken with a clear understanding of its potential for significant political capital and an undeniable enhancement of his personal reputation. Spotswood understood perfectly that a direct appeal to Governor Eden for assistance in capturing Teach would be futile. The depth of their corrupt alliance meant such a request would either be stonewalled or, worse, covertly relayed to Teach himself, allowing him to escape. He therefore made the bold and arguably unprecedented decision to act unilaterally, in absolute secrecy and with unwavering resolve. He bypassed North Carolina's compromised government entirely. Instead, he channeled his efforts through the Royal Navy, dispatching an urgent, confidential message to Captain Ellis Brand of the HMS Pearl and Captain Gordon of the HMS Lyme, two warships then strategically stationed in Virginia waters. He offered a significant bounty for Blackbeard's capture, a sum of £100 for Teach himself and lesser amounts for his crew. This generous financial incentive was a shrewd move, understanding that even among disciplined naval crews, the prospect of prize money was often the most effective motivator, ensuring their zealous commitment to such a dangerous mission. The daunting task of hunting down Blackbeard himself was entrusted to Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the HMS Pearl. Imagine Maynard at this point in his career, a capable, determined Royal Navy officer, steeped in the rigorous discipline and unwavering tradition of the British fleet. He was a man of quiet purpose, meticulous in his preparations, and selected for his reliability and his unwavering commitment to duty. For Maynard, this was not just another assignment. It was a singular opportunity for significant professional advancement, a chance to achieve a celebrated, career-defining victory against the most infamous pirate of the age. His future, and indeed his very reputation within the Royal Navy, would be inextricably linked to the outcome of this dangerous and highly publicized assignment. The expedition itself had to be planned with extreme care and maintained under absolute secrecy. Teach's extensive knowledge of the labyrinthine Carolina Outer Banks, combined with his network of informants, or at least those who would eagerly warn him of any approaching warships, meant that any overt naval deployment would almost certainly be spotted. A fleet of large Royal Navy vessels would be too conspicuous, too slow for the shallow waters, and too easily anticipated, allowing Teach to simply melt away into the complex maze of creeks and hidden coves that formed his sanctuary. Spotswood and Maynard therefore made a crucial strategic decision. They would not use the larger, deep-draft warships for the direct pursuit. Instead, they acquired two smaller, more maneuverable sloops, capable of navigating the shallow, treacherous channels of Ocracoke Inlet, where Teach was known to reside. These sloops, likely unarmed or lightly armed merchant vessels requisitioned for the task, would be crewed by highly disciplined and experienced sailors volunteered from the Royal Navy ships, ensuring their loyalty, fighting prowess, and professional conduct. The larger warships, the Pearl and the Lime, would remain at sea, providing distant support if needed, but not directly participating in the critical inshore hunt. This decision to dispatch smaller vessels commanded by a naval lieutenant into another colony's sovereign waters without the explicit permission of its governor presented immediate and significant questions of jurisdiction and legality. From a strict legal standpoint, Governor Spotswood was indeed overstepping his authority. He was dispatching a military force into a neighbouring province without the express consent of its legitimate colonial governor, Charles Eden. This could have easily led to a severe diplomatic incident, formal accusations of invasion, and even direct political conflict between the colonial governments, potentially escalating to official reprimand from London. Governor Eden, had he been more courageous and less compromised by his own illicit dealings, could have legitimately protested Spotswood's actions, citing a blatant breach of intercolonial protocol and an affront to his authority. However, Spotswood operated under the firm conviction that the greater good and the fundamental interests of the king and empire profoundly superseded rigid adherence to colonial boundaries when corruption was so rampant and a clear and present danger to trade persisted. He shrewdly calculated that the political fallout from a successful capture of Blackbeard would be far less severe and far more manageable than the continued economic disruption and the stain on Crown authority caused by Teach's unchecked activities and Governor Eden's complicity. In Spotswood's determined eyes, he was not invading. He was rectifying a grievous failure of governance, cutting out a dangerous cancer that threatened the stability and prosperity of the entire southern colonial region. This profound moral conviction, bolstered by his personal ambition and a clear vision for an orderly colonial landscape, empowered him to take a calculated but ultimately successful political risk. Maynard's preparation of his two sloops was meticulous, reflecting his Royal Navy training. Royal Navy sailors, accustomed to strict discipline, precise movements, and the rigors of naval warfare, were carefully transferred from the larger warships. They were thoroughly armed, provisioned for a secretive expedition, and briefed in hushed tones on the dangerous nature of their mission. Imagine the quiet, palpable tension aboard these smaller vessels as they prepared to depart, the men knowing they were hunting not just another pirate, but a legend, a man whose very name carried a heavy weight of terror and invincibility. The journey itself would be slow and arduous. The intricate North Carolina coast, with its endless stretches of desolate marshland, its constantly shifting inlets, and its deceptively serene beauty, offered countless potential hiding places for a cunning outlaw. Maynard would have to proceed with utmost caution, constantly vigilant for any signs of Teach's presence, relying on discreet local intelligence gathered along the way, and remaining completely unseen until the crucial moment of engagement. The silent, measured approach, the disciplined sweep of the coastline. It was a patient, methodical hunt, a stark and deliberate contrast to the flamboyant chaos that often characterized Blackbeard's own dramatic appearances. The air was filled with a quiet sense of destiny, slowly, inexorably closing in on the legendary pirate. As November of 1718 drew to a close, Edward Teach believed himself safe, tucked away in the secluded, shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet. This remote sliver of land, part of the Outer Banks, offered a perfect sanctuary for his streamlined operation. Imagine the quiet rhythms of life there, the rustle of wind through the marsh reeds, the calls of seabirds, the low hum of conversation from his remaining crew, a mere 40 or so loyalists. They likely spent their days mending equipment, enjoying their ill-gotten gains, and perhaps gazing out at the endless expanse of the Atlantic, believing their infamous captain had once again outsmarted the authorities. Teach himself was likely at ease, confident in the protective embrace of North Carolina's corrupt officials and the natural defenses of his chosen haven. He envisioned a future where he could continue to operate in the shadows, unmolested, enjoying the fruits of his ruthlessness. However, the patient, methodical pursuit of Lieutenant Robert Maynard was drawing inexorably closer. Maynard, with his two small sloops, the Ranger and the Jane, had diligently scoured the intricate network of inlets and sounds along the North Carolina coast. His mission was one of quiet determination, a stark contrast to the flamboyant public image of the pirate he sought. The Royal Navy men under his command were disciplined, focused, and driven by both duty and the substantial bounty offered for Blackbeard's capture. On the evening of November 21st, 1718, Maynard's silent vigilance was rewarded. As dusk settled, his sloops slipped quietly into Ocracoke Inlet, guided by intelligence and sheer persistence. In the fading light, they sighted Teach's vessel, the Adventure, along with another small sloop, anchored comfortably. Imagine the quiet tension aboard Maynard's vessels, the hushed commands, the silent preparation of weapons, the sharp intake of breath as the legendary pirate's lair was finally revealed. They anchored discreetly a few miles away, waiting for the first light of dawn to make their move. The morning of November 22nd dawned cold and clear. As the first rays of sunlight touched the still waters of the inlet, Maynard's sloops began their cautious, deliberate approach. Teach and his men were caught by surprise. The sight of the two naval sloops, their colours, though possibly obscured by the early light, proclaiming their intent, would have shattered the tranquility of the inlet. Teach, ever the quick thinker, immediately recognized the gravity of his situation. He ordered his men to cut their anchor cable, hoist their sails, and attempt to escape into the deeper waters of the Outer Banks. He also reportedly shouted defiance across the water, inviting Maynard to come and face him. However, the treacherous shoals that had potentially led to the Queen Anne's Revenge grounding now worked against Teach. His vessel, the Adventure, soon ran aground, trapped. Maynard's sloops, being smaller and having shallower drafts, were able to navigate closer, though they too soon found themselves in difficulties, with the Ranger also becoming temporarily stuck. This left Maynard's own sloop, the Jane, as the primary vessel for the engagement. As the distance closed, Teach's men unleashed a devastating broadside. Despite his reduced crew, the Adventure still mounted a formidable array of swivel guns and small cannon. This initial volley proved terribly effective. Imagine the sudden deafening roar of cannon fire, the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke suddenly thick on the crisp morning air, the violent spray of water and splintering wood as shot tore through the fabric of Maynard's sloop. The deck of the Jane became a scene of immediate, horrifying chaos. Many of Maynard's men fell, killed or grievously wounded, their lives brutally cut short in an instant. Accounts suggest that as many as a third of Maynard's men were rendered casualties in this opening salvo. The Jane was left with barely a dozen men capable of fighting, a testament to the pirates' initial ferocity. Undeterred, and perhaps using this very damage as a strategic ruse, Maynard quickly ordered the majority of his remaining able-bodied men below decks, out of sight. This clever maneuver created the illusion that his crew had been decimated, making his sloop appear an easy target for boarding. Teach, ever the aggressor, saw his opportunity. He ordered his remaining men to board the Jane, believing it was now a helpless prize. Imagine the clash as Teach's pirates, led by their fearsome captain, swung across to the deck of Maynard's sloop. The air would have been filled with the clang of steel, the shouts of men, and the raw, guttural sounds of desperate close-quarters combat. This was not the orderly volley of a naval engagement, but a brutal, chaotic melee. Cutlasses flashed, pistols discharged at point-blank range, and axes found their grim purpose. Smoke from recent gunfire would have mingled with the salty spray, creating a disorienting, suffocating fog over the deck. And then, in the midst of this swirling maelstrom of conflict, the two central figures of this historical drama, Edward Teach and Robert Maynard, came face to face. Imagine the intensity of that moment. The legendary pirate, wreathed in the smoke of his burning fuses, his eyes burning with a wild intensity, confronting the determined, disciplined naval officer. It was a confrontation of opposing forces, the untamed chaos of piracy against the rigid order of the crown. Both men raised their pistols and fired almost simultaneously. Maynard's shot reportedly struck Teach, though not fatally. Teach's shot, however, missed its mark. Immediately, they closed the distance, drawing their cutlasses. The sound of steel on steel would have rung out sharply above the din of the battle. It was a life or death struggle, a microcosm of the larger conflict that raged around them. The fight was ferocious. Teach, a man of immense physical presence and hardened by countless battles, fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. Yet Maynard, though perhaps smaller in stature, was a skilled swordsman, trained in the disciplined combat of the Royal Navy. He lunged, parried, and defended with resolute precision. The battle on the deck of the Jane seemed to hinge on this single, pivotal duel. The struggle was prolonged and brutal. Teach, despite his ferocity, eventually began to succumb to the relentless assault. He was, according to historical accounts, shot at least 5 times and received more than 20 cutlass wounds, a testament to his incredible resilience and his refusal to yield. Life began to pour out of him, staining the deck. With a final, agonizing effort, he attempted to strike Maynard, but was intercepted by one of Maynard's men, a Highlander, who delivered a decisive blow that finally brought the fearsome pirate down. The great Blackbeard, the terrifying meteor of the seas, fell to the deck of the Jane, his reign of terror suddenly, definitively at an end. His fall sent a ripple through the remaining pirate crew. With their charismatic and seemingly invincible leader gone, their will to fight evaporated. The remaining pirates, demoralized and outmatched, quickly surrendered or were overwhelmed. The battle, though short, had been ferociously contested, leaving the deck of Maynard's sloop a horrifying tableau of fallen men, both naval and pirate. The cost of victory was starkly evident in the quiet aftermath, the silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the lapping of the waves against the hull. In a grim but practical act, Maynard ordered Teach's head to be severed and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop. This was not merely an act of barbarity, but a stark, undeniable proof of Blackbeard's death. In an age before photography or formal identification, this grisly display served as definitive evidence for Governor Spotswood and the wider colonial authorities that the infamous pirate was truly gone. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Blackbeard's reign of terror was over. Maynard then set sail, carrying his wounded and his grim trophy back to Virginia. The news of Blackbeard's demise spread rapidly through the colonies, bringing a profound sense of relief to merchants, officials, and ordinary citizens alike. The fear that had gripped the coastal communities for so long began to recede, replaced by a cautious optimism. The death of Edward Teach marked a pivotal moment, not just for the individual pirate, but for the entire Golden Age of Piracy. It signaled a renewed and determined effort by colonial powers to bring order to the seas, a tightening of the net that would, in time, see the great pirate havens dismantled, and the era of the freebooter draw to its inevitable close. The echoes of his final desperate struggle resonated across the calm waters of Ocracoke, marking the end of a legend and ushering in a new chapter of maritime history. The final brutal moments on the deck of Lieutenant Maynard's sloop, the subsequent journey back to Virginia with Edward Teach's severed head impaled upon the bowsprit, marked not an end to his story, but a powerful, indelible beginning to his legend. His death, far from extinguishing his notoriety, instead cemented his place as the ultimate, quintessential pirate of the Golden Age. It was a dramatic, violent denouement that perfectly fit the fearsome persona he had so meticulously crafted, ensuring his name would echo through the centuries, long after the last pirate ship had been brought to heel. Imagine the swift spread of the news, from the quiet shores of Ocracoke, through the bustling ports of Virginia and the Carolinas, and eventually across the vast Atlantic to the coffee houses and drawing rooms of London. The tale of Blackbeard's demise would have been recounted with a mix of relief, awe, and perhaps even a grudging respect for his ferocity. This immediate public interest laid the groundwork for his immortalization, transforming him from a historical figure into a powerful cultural archetype. One of the most crucial elements in solidifying Teach's enduring legacy was the publication of Captain Charles Johnson's seminal work, A General History of the Pirates, in 1724. This book, released just 6 years after Blackbeard's death, dedicated a significant and highly descriptive chapter to him. While Johnson's account may have taken liberties with factual accuracy, embellishing details for dramatic effect, it provided the vivid, compelling narrative that would define Blackbeard for generations. It gave him the smouldering beard, the multiple pistols, the menacing demeanor, all the theatrical elements that burned him into the popular imagination. This single literary work, quickly becoming a bestseller, transformed a historical pirate into a folk devil, a figure of terrifying fascination, and provided the primary template for almost every subsequent portrayal. From Johnson's pages, Blackbeard leapt into the realm of popular culture. He became the very embodiment of the pirate archetype in countless books, plays, and eventually film and television. Early adventure novels, designed to thrill and entertain, frequently drew inspiration from his persona, often presenting a romanticized, swashbuckling version of piracy, with Blackbeard as its ultimate, fearsome antagonist. Even in children's literature, A sanitized version of his daring would sometimes appear, highlighting the adventure while softening the brutality. In the realm of modern media, Blackbeard's presence is ubiquitous. Consider the epic Pirates of the Caribbean film franchise. While many characters are original creations or amalgamations, the very atmosphere, the blend of historical grit with supernatural elements, owes a debt to figures like Teach. Indeed, in Pirates of the Caribbean, on Stranger Tides, Blackbeard himself is explicitly featured as the primary antagonist, portrayed with a sinister grandeur that directly reflects the legend. Television series, such as NBC's Crossbones, have also attempted to delve into his life, often focusing on his intelligence, his strategic mind, and the complex relationships he navigated, even amidst his brutality. These adaptations, while taking creative liberties, continually reintroduce his story to new audiences, ensuring his legend remains vibrant. Perhaps nowhere is Blackbeard's captivating power more evident than in the world of video games. Titles like Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag place players directly into the Golden Age of Piracy, with Teach as a prominent, unforgettable character. In these interactive experiences, players don't just read about Blackbeard, they sail with him, witness his terrifying tactics, and participate in a virtual world heavily shaped by his presence. This level of immersive engagement allows millions to directly experience the mystique of his persona, solidifying his status as a digital icon. Beyond the formal narratives, Blackbeard continues to haunt the folklore of the places he terrorized. Along the outer banks of North Carolina, particularly around Ocracoke Island, tales persist of his buried treasure. Despite a lack of credible historical evidence for significant caches, locals might tell stories of his ghost, or of strange lights seen in the marshes, connecting the landscape intimately with his enduring spirit. His name is etched onto local businesses, street names, and tourist attractions, making him an integral part of the regional identity, a ghostly captain overseeing the very waters that claimed him. What is it about Edward Teach that lends him such enduring captivation? The reasons are multifaceted, weaving together his historical actions with the potent power of myth. Firstly, there is the theatricality of his persona. He wasn't just a pirate, he was a performance artist of terror. His deliberate self-fashioning, the wild braided beard, the smouldering fuses, the array of weapons, was uniquely dramatic and visually striking. It was a performance designed to disarm, to instill fear without the need for bloodshed. This inherent theatricality makes him a perfect fit for storytelling across any medium, a character whose image is instantly iconic. Secondly, the mystery surrounding his origins contributes significantly to his allure. The almost complete absence of verifiable details about his early life leaves a tantalizing void that imagination rushes to fill. Was he from a noble family? A common sailor? This ambiguity allows for constant reinterpretation, inviting us to project our own curiosities onto the man behind the myth. Even the debate over the grounding of the Queen Anne's revenge, intentional or accidental, adds a layer of historical intrigue, suggesting a cunning mind constantly at work, even in supposed defeat. Thirdly, and perhaps most powerfully, is his dramatic and defiant end. Unlike many pirates who met their fate quietly on the gallows, Teach went down fighting in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle against overwhelming odds. His refusal to surrender, his numerous wounds, and his final desperate defiance provide a tragic, epic conclusion that elevates him beyond a mere criminal. It's the stuff of legend, a fittingly violent last act for a life lived on the fringes of chaos. This kind of demise resonates with a deep-seated human fascination for rebellious figures who defy authority until their very last breath. Finally, Teach embodies the quintessential archetype of the Golden Age pirate. He represents the romanticized image of absolute freedom, rebellion against established order, the pursuit of untold treasure, and a life lived constantly on the edge of danger. He captures the essence of an era when individual audacity could, however briefly, challenge the might of empires. He became the ultimate symbol of that fleeting period, a dark star whose brilliance was brightest, just as the era began to wane. His story appeals to the part of us that dreams of escape, of defiance, and of forging one's own rules in a world of strictures. Blackbeard's death, while a specific historical event, also serves as a potent symbol for the definitive close of the Golden Age of Piracy. His demise signaled a crucial shift in the balance of power on the high seas. The Royal Navy, no longer preoccupied with major European wars, could now turn its full, concentrated might towards suppressing piracy. His capture and execution were part of a broader, more aggressive campaign. The era of easy pirate havens was coming to an end. Places like Nassau, once thriving pirate republics, were systematically cleaned out and re-established under firm crown control, often by former privateers turned governors like Woodes Rogers. Without reliable bases to repair ships, sell loot, recruit men, and evade pursuit, the pirate lifestyle became increasingly unsustainable. The economic incentive dwindled as legitimate trade protection improved. Furthermore, colonial authorities, spurred by figures like Governor Spotswood, implemented stricter anti-piracy laws. Admiralty courts became more efficient, and the likelihood of capture and swift public execution for those who persisted became a terrifying reality. The period of the King's Pardon ended, replaced by an uncompromising policy of outright suppression. The flow of new recruits, once a torrent of unemployed mariners, dwindled to a trickle as the risks far outweighed the diminishing rewards. Some individuals transitioned to smuggling or returned to privateering in later conflicts, but the open, large-scale, and audacious piracy that defined Blackbeard's era largely ceased. So, as we reflect upon the life and death of Edward Teach, Blackbeard, we are left not just with a historical account, but with the echo of a profound myth. He remains the quintessential pirate, his historical reality often overshadowed by the powerful, enduring legend he created, and that continues to be reimagined. He stands as a dark, compelling figure who shone brightest at the end of a fleeting, lawless age, forever embodying the thrill and the terror of the pirate dream.